video starts off with me naming fictional monsters, because, well, I need to grab your attention and keep your attention so you go, ooh, what's he going to be talking about today? But there are cars that are exactly that. Monsters. We're talking things like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the Kraken, any other monster from the ocean depths, and my personal favourite that scared the living bejesus out of me every single time and made me turn my console off, Nemesis. 25 years later, and him bursting through that window in the Raccoon City police station still gets me. You know he's coming and oh lord he coming, but iconic is what he is. It is. It's not actually been proven what it is at this point. But there was one so named because it was a Japanese monster going around devouring everything in sight for pure fun. This is the part where I'd go, you probably know what I'm talking about at this point, but it's in the title of the video, so let's say it together. Godzilla. So for this, we need to understand where these cars stood in terms of FIA Class Structure, because this all came at a time when classes were a little confusing and had different lettered names, and also at a time when something like Group C could be faster than Group B and so on, and those classes could be different based upon what series they were in because, well, standardization wasn't in the FIA's vocabulary. Group B in Rally had gone. Now you might be thinking, hang on a second, isn't this a touring car? But bear with me here. Group B had been cancelled due to the deaths and crashes that had happened through 1986. While Group B was basically prototypes for the rally stages of Monte Carlo, Kenya and Sweden, Group A was production car based and ran alongside Group B. And these regulations covered rally and touring cars in probably the first time a category had some sort of overlap in FIA history. But I'm not going to go through every rule set to prove that point. Group A cars were limited in power, cost, tech, and weight, but as you're about to find out, cost is, well, it's one of those things that just goes mental no matter how many sort of limits you impose. Now, Group B had been pretty expensive and powerful, so they brought back the Group A stuff and sort of made that the higher class, so that basically it was the cars that you could buy from any showroom anywhere in your particular country. Back to the traditional win on Sunday, sell on Monday stuff. Check out this picture of a Mitsubishi Lancer Evo 6. It looks like a normal Evo 6. Alright, the chassis, roll cage, body panels and so on aren't going to be factory fresh and all the stuff underneath is going to be purpose made for the Safari Rally, but it's a Lancer. Well, a Lancer Evo. And the same goes for this Celica. A few extra bits on it versus a dealer spec one, but outwardly, it's a Celica. And yes, that's how it's pronounced in Britain. I remember the ad saying Celica. Now, it has to be said here that Group A was being used in varying forms before the FIA banned Group B. Group B was the top class in rallying and then had Group A below it as a production car series. The European Touring Car Championship was using Group A in 1982. The BTCC followed in 1983. DTM started using them in 1984 and the Australian Touring Car Championship in 1985. Because, as mentioned, Group A was production car based, which is what a real, in inverted commas, touring car should be. By the late 1980s, the car usually at the top of the pecking order was the Sierra RS500 Cosworth, a car I'd love to be able to show you a picture of, but it's an absolute weapon of a car. Sheer pornography. If I show you a picture, instant demonetized. Pure filth. The Sierra RS500 Cosy was a staple of the BTCC, the sky blue, navy blue and white caliber livery being one of the most iconic in the series' history. While not overly successful in Britain, it was winning championships left, right and centre all over the world, with its turbo inline 4 producing something like 540 horsepower. And if you want to get one now, be prepared to part with 150 grand upwards for a good one. And that's just from a private seller. Auction, $500,000, easy. However, there was something brewing over in the land of the rising sun. The Nissan Skyline had been in production since the late 1950s, the first models rolling off the factory floor in 1957. More generations followed, 1963, 1968, 1972, 1977, 1981 and 1985. But we need to concern ourselves with what started being produced in 1989, specifically the R32. Also, I'm going to be doing my best with photos here because in terms of pictures of the Group A car, there aren't that many. Plenty of regular R32s, but yeah, licensing and all that, I've got to keep it legal. Japan was in an economic boom at the time, but at the same time Nissan was struggling. The R31 hadn't been well received and Nissan had decided that they were basically going to build the Japanese BMW M3, but build it from the outset to be a competition ready car and be ready to go in Group A from the very beginning. Available as a two-door coupe or as a four-door saloon, it was available as a rear-wheel drive only or four-wheel drive car, and the engine choices were numerous. But really, you want the 2.6-litre twin-turbo because, well... The four-wheel drive system was always rear-wheel drive on corner exit, and rear-wheel drive only, and then kick the rest in afterwards. Nissan did this deliberately to try and cut down on corner exit understeer. Basically, what had happened was they'd seen Porsche's four-wheel drive system, which had at least 20% on the front at any given point, and they thought, well, that's just going to give the thing understeer, so they worked in their way of doing things, which was actually highly advanced for the time. And you also want the 5-speed manual because Kansai Doriftu, which, according to Urban Dictionary, translates to a hella badass inertia drift. Now, in terms of showing you close-ups of a model, unfortunately, the older Skyline in Assetto Corsa is the R34, and all the mods for the R32 are bad ports from Gran Turismo, or they're just terrible. So, showing you close-ups is going to be a pain. But anyway, in the June of 1989, the R32 GTR, which is the specific model we're looking at, but Skyline, R32, GTR, Godzilla, they're all interchangeable words in this video. That car was released in Japan, and a Group A version of the car was being considered and rumoured. In Australia, the motoring press down there hadn't realised that the first 500 GTRs built were the homologation build run. And then in the October of 1989, Gibson Motorsport in Australia took delivery of 4 R32 GTR spaceships straight from Japan. Gibson had been using the previous model Skyline, so the R31, and because of their relationship with Nissan, they'd be the first racing team, at least as far as I can tell outside of Japan, to get hold of these cars. But thanks to the homologation done on the car, they could either disable HiCAS or run the system as intended. HiCAS basically translates to four-wheel steering. Both the Skyline and the Honda Prelude would be the two cars of the era to have this system. But there's a lot of Elon Musk and Tesla simps out there that seem to think this Cybertruck pile of is the first thing to have it. Fast forward to 1990 and the first on-track tests are conducted at Winton Raceway. A young Mark Scaife tests a new R32 while Jimmy Richards uses the R31 as a yardstick. The two cars run back to back, with the R32 using a Japanese issue electronic limiter to limit the turbo boost and keep the power in the 550 horsepower range. Gibson intended to use their own electronic system to get the power up to 580. At the same time, a 6-speed gearbox was being developed that Nissan liked so much, they bought some. The car made its competitive debut at Malala in the June of 1990. You'd got Scaife in the new R32 basically being the test mule, and you got Richards in the old R31 to maximise his points hauls because of reliability and stuff like that. But in qualifying for the race, Scaife was about 2.5 seconds under the lap record and was a second faster than Peter Brock in a Ford Sierra. Yes, Holden fans, Peter Brock in a Sierra. Going all the way up into October, Nissan entered just the one car for the Bathurst 1000, with Richards and Scaife behind the wheel. But there were struggles as the brakes weren't working as well as they should have been, and they couldn't get the four-wheel drive differential working properly. After fiddling with it, they put the car in two-wheel drive mode and just sent it out there. Scaife was 11th in qualifying, but in the race, Richards got it up through the field into the lead, and was extending that lead by about a second a lap. They'd eventually finish 18th and 5 laps down due to misfires and other problems. The car had a lot of problems through 1990, and it was probably a good thing they used Scaife as the test mule. Also at this point, Nissan had homologated the Nismo GTR for absolute screw you, this is a racing car energy. It was blown turbo here, misfire there, cylinder blocks cracking elsewhere, brakes being rubbish, but the car was chucking out 600 horsepower. But the Nissans were having to go through a new cylinder block every race because of a weird harmonic in the engine, which Gibson invested money in their own machines to help get rid of. In 1991, the season started at Sandown, and the two Nissans just absolutely vaulted off into the lead, and they would, well, win pretty easily. They basically finished in formation, and they were getting a 20-metre head start just off the line because of the four-wheel drive system. Then they went to Tasmania, and Richards was something like 2 seconds faster than everybody else. As you can imagine, the Australian Touring Car Championship's favourite words started being lobbed around. Parity. They needed to slow the Nissans down because now all the issues were largely ironed out, the car was going to be unstoppable. Other teams started adding non-homologated parts onto their cars because CAMS was sitting on its hands for the time being and not bothering to touch the Nissans. Such was the what's the point attitude, only 11 cars went to Western Australia for the round at Wanneroo. A lot of the teams were skipping the round to do some extreme weight loss and power output increases on the cars. At Lakeside, it was another 1-2 with Richards lapping everybody up to 5th. Then the Australian Motorsport Press starts attributing a nickname to these Nissans, which quickly catches on, not just in Australia, but around the whole world. And it's actually stuck around even today. Godzilla. The Nissans had finished 1-2 at the opening 5 rounds of the season. That was until Dick Johnson had managed to acquire some tyres from Yokohama, straight from the factory in Japan. All these tyres can be described as is trick. And they worked. Johnson and John Bowe locked out the front row and they managed to lead for a good amount of time. But it was no use. The Nissans had more grip and traction because of 4-wheel drive, but ultimately the race was won by Tony Longhurst, breaking the Skyline stranglehold on the series. Longhurst was driving an M3. But there was something else going on at the time that the other teams were looking at with great interest, because it turned out that Gibson was slightly underfunded. They needed more sponsorship, and it looked like they might actually be cutting down to one car for 1992, with Jim Richards going to TWR and Holden. So there was all that going on, but at the same time, CAMS had finally pulled their fingers out and started to look at ways of slowing down Godzilla. Among the ideas were banning the 4-wheel drive system and making them run rear drive only, allowing 4-wheel drive but making the cars run skinnier tyres, or putting a restrictor on the cars like they do in the WRC. Gibson threatened legal action, so CAMS said, "Alright, well what do you suggest?" Gibson's argument was that with the restrictor the car was 2 seconds slower, and other options made the car completely uncompetitive. The other argument was, why should we be penalised? We've been within the rules the whole time. Of the 9 rounds of that season, the Skylines were dominant. Richards ended up winning the season in the slower of the 2 cars. Tony Longhurst in the BMW M3, another iconic car of the Group A era, was the only other driver along with Richards and Scaife to win a race. But the numbers were telling. The car was too good. And in a series where it was predominantly Ford versus Holden or Ford versus GM, the traditionalist fans probably weren't happy either. Also at Bathurst in 1991, Richards hit 300 km an hour or about 180 miles an hour on the Conrod Straight, with the 2 R32s locking out the front row. The car then dominated the 1,000 km race, with Richards and Scaife finishing a lap ahead of second place, a Holden Commodore driven by Wyn Percy and Alan Grice. It was 2 laps ahead of third, and 4 ahead of fourth. 1992 rolls around. The Gibson team is now in the red, white and yellow of Winfield cigarettes, and Scaife would win the opening round at Amaru Park overall. But Peter Brock shocked everybody by winning Heat 1 of the round to take the first victory for a Holden since 1986. The cars were also gifted a weight penalty of 40 kilograms, and CAMS had told the Nissan team that they had to run Formula 1 style pop-off valves to restrict the power output. The power was now down from 640 or so to 450. And that weight penalty and the power nerf was intended to hit them hard, because the car was already heavier than the Sierras anyway, so without the power to overhaul the weight should have messed them about. Despite Gibson's objections and an actual attempt at taking CAMS to court, it was all projection, because Scaife and Richards once again dominated the season, Scaife winning the championship with 234 points to Richards' 214. Tony Longhurst was third with 194, and then John Bowe on 175. Despite all the nerfing of the overpowered Godzillas, Nissan still dominated. The car also won Bathurst in the most messed up way possible. During the race it absolutely hammered it down in the closing stages and was later red flagged on 145, with the results taken from lap 143 because so many cars crashed and the officials made exceptions to allow everybody to be classified. The finish is absolutely dripping with controversy because in that rainstorm the Winfield Nissan had slid off the road at Forest Elbow and absolutely wrecked the car. So many argued at the time that Dick Johnson and John Bowe in a Sierra should have won the race instead. But because the race results were taken from lap 133 when the Nissan was still on the track and leading, Scaife and Richards were declared the winners. The ending of that race also had an additional black cloud over it, because during that rainstorm, 1967 Formula 1 World Champion Denny Hulme had been on his radio to his crew back in the pits, claiming he couldn't see properly. The team assumed he couldn't see because of the rain. In reality, Hulme was in the midst of suffering a heart attack, and he pulled off the road on the Conrod Straight and came to a stop. When it was evident that he wasn't getting out of the car, marshals rushed to him, and they found him still strapped into his BMW. He was taken to hospital in Bathurst, but was pronounced dead. Back on the podium, the crowds weren't particularly happy. Not only had a crash car somehow won the race, it had won at the expense of a Ford, one of the 2 main characters of the series along with Holden, because Australian touring cars at its core is Ford versus GM, and that's it. You got Dick Johnson, who was a crowd favourite, and he's thinking he should have won the race, and he wound up the crowd a little bit by saying, well, it looks like you can be beaten by a crashed car. It also didn't help that the other Nissan had gone up in third place because, well, they'd finished third, and Neil Crompton was waving the middle finger at the crowd as well, just to get them a little bit riled up. The sponsor of the event was Tooheys, a beer company, and Scaife had been putting cans of the stuff in his race suit to lob back at the crowd because they were already throwing stuff at the podium before anybody had gone up. Being the elder statesman and being a bit more gentlemanly and a bit more old school, and also at the same time being quite upset that his friend had died in the race, Richards told him to put the cans away and said he'd sort it himself, delivering one of the most epic speeches on a podium ever given. I'm just really stunned for words. I can't believe this reception. I thought Australian race fans had a lot more to go than this. This is bloody disgraceful. I'll keep racing, but this is going to remain for me for a long time. You're a pack of arseholes. But watching some clips of this thing going around a track, it's like an LMP1 car or those new WRC things they've got. It just puts the power down so effortlessly. No wonder it dominated in Australia and in Japan. It won all 29 races it entered. The thing was absolutely unstoppable. And there's a reason they called it Godzilla. It just ate everything up. And that name stuck around nearly 30 years later. Just devoured everything in sight, and there wasn't a single track where it had a disadvantage. But in Australia, it was deemed too good. CAMS later reformatted the rulebook for the ATCC Championship to basically cater to the Ford Falcon and the Holden Commodore. Turbos, dead. Four-wheel drive, dead. Four-wheel steering, dead. And the rulebook rewritten to become the precursor to what is now V8 supercars. Not just to preserve the homegrown element of the series, but because of the Australian recession at the time. $500,000 Australian dollars for a competitive Sierra or Skyline. It made the series untenable for a privateer, so they switched to a cheaper V8 format. Well, I mean, Ford and Holden threatening to quit probably helped as well. But Godzilla being made extinct through the drawing up of what would become V8 supercars and also other touring car series dropping the Group A regulations for other rule sets made it one of the peak moments of this car was too good and had to go. And through games like Gran Turismo, it's become an icon of car culture and is still very popular the world over. Unlike the Mazda 787B, Godzilla really was too good, too fast, too dominant. They had to get rid of it because the costs were just going to skyrocket, and they already had. Also, Australia having a recession probably didn't help things, but it absolutely destroyed everything in front of it for 3 years. There was no track that it didn't have a disadvantage at. There's a reason why it was called Godzilla, and it's a car very deserving of its nickname, if you ask me. So then, a look at Nissan's Godzilla GTR Skyline R32. If this has taught you something new about this particular subject, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job. And for more like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the kind folk at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and my affiliates. Well, there's super thanks and memberships down there if that's more your thing. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind. Have a great day wherever you are. Sayonara.